All right, good afternoon. Today's talk is entitled "The Revolution Will Be Tokenized." And you may think that this is a talk just about crypto, but it's really not. This talk is actually about technocracy versus freedom. So you might wonder what tokenization is. Tokenization is the process of turning an asset, a right, or identities into digital tokens on a ledger. It is essentially the evolution of the database. And there are essentially two different paths we can go down. We can go down a tyrannical path where governments and third parties can track, censor, and program these tokens, or we can have tokens that are held privately in our own possession, that can be traded without third parties. This is why this is an important issue. This issue is as important as free will itself. Currently, most of the economy runs on centralized databases, and centralized databases are themselves a form of silent tyranny. Even money itself is stored in a central database. You may not know this, but the Federal Reserve operates on an Oracle database. Most commercial banks operate using either an Oracle database or a Microsoft database backed by reserves in the Federal Reserve's Oracle database. So the entire system is already using these centralized databases. And these centralized databases are controlled by multiple third parties, including technical intermediaries. So you have Oracle, Microsoft, the IRS, the Federal Reserve, and others. There are a lot of problems with centralized databases. For one, there's a single point of failure. There's no transparency. There's an administrator in the middle who can freeze or censor information and transactions. And your identity can be attached to these centralized databases. In other words, your life is a row in someone else's spreadsheet. And we have given away our rights over the last few decades through what are called click-wrap agreements. You've probably we've all signed them, whether it's, you sign up for iTunes, you sign up for Amazon, all the things that you scroll down and just click accept. The average American signs 150 click-wrap agreements per year. And to give you an idea of how extensive these are, these things that we don't read, the Microsoft operating system has a 70-page end user license. Amazon has a 12,000-word terms and conditions. Wells Fargo has a 30-page document just for online access, which doesn't include your full bank account itself. And to tell you how absurd this was, there was a lawsuit recently where a doctor died at a restaurant from food poisoning on a property owned by Disney. And Disney tried to use the fact that he had a Disney Online agreement to get out of the lawsuit. So we have gradually given up our rights, voluntarily, unbeknownst to us. If we were to read all of these contracts, it would take 1 hour a day, 365 days a year. It's literally a life sentence of reading. So this is tied into these centralized databases. There are other problems with centralized databases. There are often breaches. You probably get these things all of the time, whether it's Microsoft or any number of services. Social Security's had issues. It's estimated that the total amount of damages from not just database breaches, but cyber attacks in general is approaching $10.5 trillion a year. So the battle lines here are really freedom versus tyranny with respect to tokenization. Tokenization is going to happen because being able to digitally represent an asset on a blockchain solves a lot of the problems with centralized databases. You get rid of the centralization aspect, the fact that these databases can be edited and modified. It is an upgrade of sorts, but it depends on which path we go down. And by the way, the path that we seem to be going down is the tyrannical version, where you're going to have third parties controlling the tokens. As I said before, the programmability, the tracking, and the censorship of them. And this will lead to things like requiring real IDs, the wallets themselves being able to be controlled by the government, if not directly, then through legislation, forced enrollment, and censorship built in. The solution to this are private tokens, which I'll talk about further, which can be anonymous, which you can have in your own possession, your own self-custody, which can be audited, and that are completely and totally voluntary. Now, I've talked about this topic a lot. In fact, this is 3 years in a row I've been warning people about CBDCs or talking about CBDCs. CBDCs are just a tokenized form of money. That's really what a CBDC is. It's also what a stablecoin is. And as I'll discuss later in the talk, they're actually the same thing, depending upon who's regulating them and who's issuing them. But the goal doesn't just stop at tokenizing money. The ultimate plan is to tokenize all of our assets, not just money, our stocks, our bonds, even our own physical movement can and will be tokenized if we let the technocratic plan move as it is. And in fact, the ultimate end game here is a situation where you have one global ledger with everyone's assets, monetary and non-monetary, all backed by a single currency controlled by energy credits. And I know that may sound a little bit ridiculous, and a lot of people aren't familiar with technocracy, and they confuse technocracy and technology, and I will show you in a few slides what the real difference is and what technocracy is all about. I wrote an article talking about 50 shades of central bank digital tyranny, and kind of we're at this, level 3 in this kind of system where we already have, our money is already a CBDC, which I'll talk about, and it's just moving to greater and greater levels of programmability and tracking. So I want to play this video that Derek Bros put together, which is a great introduction to technocracy if you're not familiar with it.
As a technocrat, let's dive in. In the early 20th century, a movement began to develop around a political theory known as technocracy, a system wherein management of governments is handled by technical experts, often involving technology-focused solutions. Early proponents of technocracy claimed that the concept would lead to better management of resources and the protection of the planet. However, this system of governance by technological experts and their technology would also involve a loss of privacy, as well as centralization of power and the management of all human behavior. Although the term appears to have been largely forgotten, the technocratic philosophy and influence can be seen everywhere in our modern digital world.
Already beginning to arrive at the huge civic auditorium, where a large receptive audience turned out to hear Howard Scott as he warned of an impending crisis in America's domestic and foreign affairs.
One of the most influential proponents of technocracy was a man named Howard Scott, a writer who founded the Technical Alliance in New York City in 1919. Scott believed that business owners lacked the necessary skills and data to reform their industry, and thus, control should be handed over to engineers. The technocrats publicized their vision of a centrally planned world via books, speeches, clubs, and political parties. This resulted in a brief period of popularity in the US and Canada in the years following the Great Depression. As politicians and economists searched for a solution to the financial calamity, the technocrats imagined a world where politicians and business owners were replaced with scientists, engineers, and other technical experts who would manage the economy. However, in the 1940s, mainstream interest in the technocracy movement seemed to dissipate. The ideas that underpinned the technocratic vision received a notable endorsement in 1970 when political scientist Zbigniew Brzezinski released his book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. Brzezinski will be familiar to long-term researchers of the ruling elite. Until his death in 2018, Brzezinski was a diplomat who ran in the same circles as David Rockefeller and former Secretary of State and accused war criminal Henry Kissinger. Brzezinski served as advisor to several presidents, from Jimmy Carter to Barack Obama. He was also a member of the Atlantic Council, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Although Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, substituted the term technotronic for technocratic, the depiction of the future is the same: a world in which the scientific and technological elite centrally plan the lives of all humanity. Essentially, Brzezinski's vision is a technologically advanced, authoritarian-style collectivism wherein individual liberties are subordinated to the apparent needs of the collective. When we examine the world of 2025, we clearly see the signs of technocratic influence. For example, we can see this influence in the wealthiest companies and the most influential CEOs. These individuals are running companies that have amassed large amounts of financial wealth as well as unfathomable amounts of digital data on all of their customers. From Jeff Bezos at Amazon Bill Gates of Microsoft, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, Elon Musk of Tesla and SpaceX, we can see the technocratic ideology. These men and their colleagues in various technological industries wield immense power through their companies, wealth, and cultural influence. These individuals have enough money, resources, and connections to shape elections, geoengineer the climate, and cause dips in the stock market, to name a few examples. They are the technocratic class of 2025.
So technocracy is very real. This isn't just a pipe dream or something that's even remotely just theoretical. I have another clip, but I probably won't have time to play it. But I want to talk about when I mentioned that the end goal here is a single global digital currency backed by energy credits. This has already been worked on. MasterCard has partnered with an organization called Tokenized, along with the United Nations and Climate Action Sustainable Development Goal number 13, to create a credit card that tracks your carbon usage and cuts off when you reach certain thresholds. This has been live since 2019. And so already for years, MasterCard has been building relationships with companies to track carbon output. This is why when you buy an airline ticket, you see how much CO2 is used. So behind the scenes, without us paying attention, they have already been building a system for tracking energy credits and have the ability to tie it to and censor money.
As a technocrat,
so crypto was always about separating money and state, ending war, and spreading freedom. This was what it was supposed to be about. This is why I'm wearing the Roger Ver shirt, because I know a lot of you probably heard about Bitcoin from the first time from Roger, probably maybe even at this event or another Free State event. And I want to play a clip from Roger. Oh, wait, never mind.
2008.
My bad. This is actually the economy clip. So I guess we'll play this so that you can see this in real time.
The United Nations released an urgent report emphasizing the need to cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 in order to avoid an irreversible climate crisis. The average consumer in Sweden causes around 10 tons of carbon emissions each year, of which 60% is linked to consumption. Later in 2018, Tokenized, a Swedish fintech, took on the challenge and launched Do, a mobile banking service for everyday climate action. The Do app is connected to a credit card that enables users to track and measure their carbon footprint from each purchase and to compensate for its impact day by day. This spring, Tokenized took its fight against climate change one step further by adding a premium credit card to its offer. But instead of introducing a premium credit card with the typical benefits that encourages further mass consumption, Tokenized did the opposite by launching Do Black, the world's first credit card with a carbon limit. Simply put, it's the first credit card ever to stop you from overspending. Not based on your available funds, but rather on the levels of CO2 emissions caused by your consumption. Do Black helps you track your climate impact and ensures that you reduce it by 50% in line with the UN 2030 recommendation.
The core purpose of Do Black is not only the ability to measure the impact of your consumption, but also bringing it to a direct halt, making it a radical tool against climate change.
For years, credit cards have put a limit on our credit. Do Black puts a limit on our impact.
When I first saw that, I thought it was an ad for a Black Mirror episode. But this actually exists, and this is growing and expanding, and this has been a concerted push behind the scenes by technocrats. And I find it very frustrating because I even find some libertarians that look at Palantir or look at Elon Musk and say, oh, well, they're just applying technology to make government more efficient. Couldn't be further from the truth. This is a very coordinated strategy to push a specific ideology, which is that you will have a system where elites pick scientists and engineers to make decisions for everyone, And the currency for this new society will be based on manufactured scarcity through energy credits. And that's exactly what's going on. And in fact, people are now cheering on the acceleration of technocracy under Trump, when if Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates were doing the same thing 6 months ago, they would have been, actually rioting in the streets about it. So Bitcoin was supposed to be the answer, but Bitcoin was hijacked. And I'm not going to go into all the details around that, but Bitcoin was supposed to be peer-to-peer digital cash that people could use without third parties. Instead, we have been going in the complete opposite direction. I've argued that in a way we already have a CBDC. As I mentioned at the beginning, our money is already largely digital. It's 96% digital. The Federal Reserve operates on an Oracle database. Our money is already programmable. Anybody that has a health savings account or an HRA, that is programmable digital money tied to a bank. In fact, when I see RFK talk about the fact that we're going to limit the ability for people to use food stamps or EBT cards to buy sugary drinks, well, when you dig into that, what you find, that's just another level of digital programmable money. EBT cards and food stamps are actually issued at the state level, and the largest technology provider in all of this is actually JP Morgan. Our money is already trackable. I've identified at least 13 different federal government programs that are used to track and trace our financial transactions. You have the Bank Secrecy Act, you have the Patriot Act, you have the IRS now using AI to work with your bank to analyze your financial transactions. And by the way, one of those click wrap agreements that we sign and we don't look at, if you actually read the terms and conditions with your bank, what you'll find is they can share or sell your information without your consent, they can change the terms with or without your consent, and they can cancel the arrangement and agreement without cause. This is the current state. So again, most people are worried about something, not realizing we already have the financial surveillance and tracking that they think they should be afraid of in the future. Money is also censorable. I know probably many of us in this room have been debanked one or more times, but this is now hitting the mainstream. Even Melania Trump, Barron Trump, the whole Trump family has been debanked in one way or another. Kanye West, Dr. Joseph Mercola, etc. Canadian truckers. So this is already a real situation. So we really already have digital programmable money. We're already at that DEFCON 3, moving maybe into DEFCON 4, where the ultimate end state is that single global currency backed by energy credits tied to social credit systems and AI surveillance. What happens is we have three different entities pointing fingers at one another. You have, everybody wants to make the Federal Reserve the bad guy. The Federal Reserve sucks. The Federal Reserve is a completely unnecessary cartel of banks that shouldn't be involved in the money issuance process at all. But all of the tracking and the surveillance that I mentioned comes from Congress. It's issued by Congress. The Bank Secrecy Act, Patriot Act, all of that is done by Congress. The Federal Reserve is not going out on their own and figuring out ways to add this surveillance on top of people. So I actually had a conversation with Ted Cruz, and he was sitting there trying to tell me, I'm worried that Americans might experience additional financial surveillance in the future, so I'm putting together an anti-CBDC bill to preempt the Federal Reserve from issuing a CBDC without congressional approval. Meanwhile, he's actually signing on to bills that are adding financial surveillance. It's an absurd situation. But to show you how trackable our current money is, you may be aware there's something called a suspicious activity report. So if you do a financial transaction of greater than $10,000, automatically the US Treasury gets a report about it. About a month and a half ago, to fight illegal immigration, the Treasury issued an edict that says, specifically for 30 zip codes in California and Texas, that reporting threshold has been reduced from $10,000 to $200. So now anybody in those areas doing it, so they can do this today. So I hope it's important for people to realize the situation that we have today is unacceptable, because as we move into the next part of the conversation, I'm going to talk about stablecoins, which are even worse. Now, if you've sat in on my conversations in the last 2 years, 2 years ago, my wife and I were walking up and down the entire complex, with a cart where I was selling my books and running for president, trying to warn people about CBDCs. And actually, a day after PorcFest, I went to Bruce Fenton's house. I met Vivek Ramaswamy, handed him a copy of my book. And this was part of the usefulness of actually running for president as a Republican in New Hampshire, which is you get to see these guys all the time. And actually, because of the importance of New Hampshire, you can actually get an audience. Vivek actually read my book. I had 3 subsequent conversations with him about it. And in fact, he actually pushed Trump to come out against CBDCs the day before the New Hampshire primary. Not solely due to my activities or my book, but because the aggregate Free State movement here in New Hampshire shouted out that that's a very important issue. So since the election, people have been coming up to me saying, "Oh boy, you must be relieved that Trump came out against CBDCs." And it couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, with this stablecoin legislation, we are going to hyper-accelerate CBDC-level surveillance in a way that would have been unimaginable if Harris or Biden had won re-election. Because had they tried to push a CBDC from scratch, it would have been met with resistance. What's happening instead is through legislation, they're capturing an already popular stablecoin market responsible for $27 trillion a year in annual transactions. So this is actually really frightening and something I hope you think about when leaving this talk. So technocracy is rising faster in the last 6 months than I would argue in the last 4 years under Biden. Real ID was put in place. And in, I think, a handful of states, Real ID is already digital, can be added to your Google Wallet and your Apple Wallet. We have Palantir now being granted access to our tax information, in addition to all of the other horrible things that they've been involved with for years. So this is the basis of AI surveillance and possibly something that could be built into a social credit system. And as I said, stablecoins, which are, in my opinion, backdoor CBDCs. So put simply, CBDCs and stablecoins are simply tokenized money. But it's money that's tokenized in a very specific way. If you look at the Genius Act and the Stable Act, you will find, and I've read through it multiple times. I'm going to only actually discuss the most important issues related to it. One, it adds all of the surveillance that I mentioned that we have with the current banking system. So all the know your customer laws, the anti-money laundering laws, this now will apply to stablecoins. It puts stablecoins under control of the United States Congress and the Federal Reserve. So anyone issuing a stablecoin will have to provide monthly audits to the Federal Reserve. But this is the most incendiary piece to me, and this is why I mentioned, coming after Scott's a tough act to follow. But the main reason the administration is behind it is no one wants to buy U.S. Treasuries anymore. Our debt has been downgraded. China's even saying ditch the dollar, and yet we're passing these new big, beautiful bills with $1 trillion annual defense spending. How are we going to fund it? Well, the way they're going to fund it is through stablecoins, because under this legislation, if you issue a stablecoin, it has to be backed one-to-one by only United States Treasuries and dollars. You can't use gold, you can't use Bitcoin, or anything else. So if you are excited about and you're using stablecoins, understand you're funding and excited about and using something that's adding CBDC, surveillance, and funding the warfare and welfare state. Now, it's interesting timing that just, I guess yesterday or the day before, the Senate actually passed the Stable Act. And I'm not going to read Trump's quote, but of course it's all of the normal patriotic, we're going to be, own the digital asset space, and America's going to remain, and the dollar is going to remain the global reserve currency. But I want to share just how fully behind these stablecoins the entire administration is. We have David Sachs, which is our crypto AI czar. Again, why do we have czars, first of all? But beyond that, we have a member of the PayPal mafia as our crypto and AI czar. And earlier this year, he said, we'll foster stablecoins, only under strict rules. The Treasury Secretary, just last week, said stablecoins could create $2 trillion of demand for U.S. Treasuries. We are going big on digital assets. Howard Lutnick, which I don't know if I'm going to have time to get into this, but Howard Lutnick his firm invested $600 million into Tether, which is the largest stablecoin, and his firm manages all of the treasuries for Tether. So how's that for a conflict of interest? His quote, "We're going to use digital assets to pound forward," and Donald Trump is leading the way. So again, when you look at the most important aspects of the Stable and Genius Act, and I won't go through the full history, but the Genius Act is the act being pushed through the Senate, the Stable Act is being pushed through the House, and as you all know, when they reconcile the two, you get the worst parts of each. So what this means is what we're going to get from the Stable Act is they're going to ban algorithmic stablecoins, which is a fundamental area of innovation for decentralized finance and crypto. Both are going to force anti-money laundering laws and know your customer laws, and both back stablecoins that can only be backed by treasuries in the US dollar. So I find it alarming. I've been to crypto conferences where people are saying, hey, I'm excited about stablecoins. It's really going to boost crypto adoption. I don't know what these people are talking about. The point of crypto is to separate money and state. Now what we're doing is we're tokenizing fiat, adding 15 layers of risk and surveillance. It couldn't be further from crypto. And this is what people are cheering on. And by the way, I mean, the difference between whether it's issued by the central bank or whether you have large banks issuing a stablecoin, do you really care whether it's Jerome Powell or Jamie Dimon issuing your digital programmable money? It doesn't make a bit of difference from the standpoint of freedom, liberty, and privacy. I could do a whole separate talk about the ties with the Trump administration and USDC and Tether, which are the two largest stablecoins, but I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights. In Trump's first administration, he had an acting comptroller named Brian Brooks. Brian Brooks went on to Coinbase, which is the largest crypto exchange, where he worked directly with Circle to create USDC, to basically create the legal framework and format for USDC. So somebody from Trump 1's first Treasury Department working directly on the construction of USDC. And of course, I've already mentioned Howard Lutnick, but let's talk about Trump himself. And I find this alarming. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm pissed off about Nancy Pelosi's insider trading, or I can't believe that Biden's son was on the board of directors of a Ukrainian oil company. Well, let's look at stablecoins. As I mentioned before, Tether is by far the largest stablecoin out there. And the blockchain that most Tether are minted on is called Tron. Tron, by all accounts, is controlled by a guy named Justin Sun, a Chinese national. Tron doesn't work like Bitcoin. It's not a proof-of-work model. There are really 26 supernodes that control which transactions get added to the Tron blockchain. And most people believe that Justin Sun probably has majority influence or has the ability to capture the majority of these 26 nodes. Justin Sun invested $30 million in the Trump family DeFi play, World Liberty Financial. He invested $75 million into the Trump meme coin and is the single largest holder of the Trump meme coin. So, I mean, think about this. We're sitting here saying, the Trump administration is saying, well, we have this big issue with China. We're going to do all these tariffs. We're in the middle of a trade war. And then he pushes a stable coin where the issuance could potentially be controlled by the Chinese government through a Chinese national. I mean, how does that rate compared to being on the board of directors of an oil company in Ukraine? In addition to Tether and USDC, all four of the big banks are looking at CBDCs as well. In fact, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America have stated that they're working together jointly to issue a stablecoin. Bank of America has said they're going to pursue a stablecoin on their own. I will tell you, because this is common with this kind of legislation. Who do we think wrote this legislation and pushed the legislation? It's the existing bankers that already own the politicians. So my guess is, in order to be able to comply with all of the regulations that are put in place, Tether and USDC are going to end up being captive to one or more of the existing large banks. So you really, truly will end up with a situation where it's Jamie Dimon or Brian Moynihan at B of A controlling programmable digital currency. As I said, this is a big deal because last year there was $27 trillion worth of stablecoin transactions. It's estimated to grow to 120 trillion by 2030, which is more than direct deposit, Visa, and MasterCard combined. So this is a significant issue. They're capturing through legislation a baked-in CBDC with mass adoption. But this has triggered a global arms race for CBDCs. So now that the United States is doing this, other nations and central banks are looking at this saying, well, wait, we better keep up. And if you haven't been following what's going on with CBDCs, there are 134 countries representing 98% of global GDP at some stage of exploring or rolling out a CBDC. More than half of those are beyond the research phase. 11 countries have already rolled out a CBDC. In fact, shortly after the Stable and Genius Acts were announced, the head of the ECB came out and said, we may launch a digital euro, a euro CBDC, as soon as October of this year. At the same time, there is anti-money laundering laws that have been drafted to ban all privacy coins in Europe by 2027. So when people say to me, are you excited that Trump rescinded Biden's executive order and said he's against CBDCs, I couldn't, in my wildest imagination, predict that I would be sitting here right now looking at the absolute proliferation and race globally to implement digital surveillance money. And it doesn't stop with CBDCs or digital currency. This was an interview with Larry Fink from Davos, where he was talking about how excited he is for a future where stocks and bonds are tokenized. Well, do you think when Larry Fink is talking about tokenizing stocks and bonds, you're going to have them in your own self-custody? Do you think he's looking forward to a world where he gets cut out as the middleman, or do you think he's going to be part of a group that drafts legislation that means that security tokens, including stocks and bonds, are controlled by multiple third parties, and of course, BlackRock will be one of those parties? In short, I'm not telling you to call your congressman. I mean, the Genius Act has already passed. I'm not going to tell you to call your congressman to try to block it in the House. It's absolutely fucking hopeless. But we cannot comply our way out of technocracy. We're at the point right now, this is a very critical point where we need to take a stand and stop using the dollar and stop using stable coins. And unfortunately, I'll go to crypto conferences, and as I said before, people will say stablecoins are great for crypto adoption. Or I guess we lost medium of exchange and should just accept stablecoins. If we don't have medium of exchange, we don't have the ability for people to voluntarily interact with one another. That is the basis of freedom. So you can't ignore that or just say, oops, we lost on that, but at least we have meme coins. So the answer to this is still the battleground is tokenization. We need to move towards privacy tokens. Privacy isn't a feature, it is the foundation of freedom. The only way to defeat CBDCs and stablecoin tyranny is to build outside their system, not to integrate with it. And privacy coins have to be as easy to use as traditional finance and CBDCs. But we no longer have the excuse that people won't use digital currency. People are already using digital currency. They're already using stable coins. There's no argument to be made there. We have to make our products and services compete. I remember when I got my first Bitcoin, and at the time in 2012, it was actually better, faster, and cheaper than anything that was available through the traditional financial system. We didn't have Venmo. We didn't have Zelle or Google Pay or Apple Pay. But now the reverse is true. Now these are actually technically easier to use products, even though they have all of the tyranny associated with it. But we lost the advantage of being the easiest and cheapest to use currency. And so it's not just about privacy coins replacing fiat or replacing stablecoins. We need to be able to privately tokenize stocks, bonds, and all of the other assets. Money only represents 5% of global assets. It's largely financial instruments and mortgages and other things that make up the rest. We have to be able to tokenize and trade those privately. So this is why when I say the revolution will be tokenized, we actually have an opportunity to do this. Roger Ver introduced me to this concept about a year ago. In fact, you know, when he got out of, I was giving a talk about him at the Libertarian Convention, and he reached out to me after he got out on bail, and he didn't want to talk about his legal case. He said to me, I saw a podcast you were on where you were talking about the importance of easy-to-use wallets and easy-to-use point-of-sale systems. You should really take a look at Zeno. So I did, and I've spent, you know, the last year really digging into it, using it, reading the white paper, meeting with the team, and I think this is the single best shot that we have to stop this centralized tokenization tyranny that is going on. I'm not going to go through a lot of the details because immediately after this talk in the Daylight Moneratopia tent, there is going to be a Zeno workshop where you can learn how it works and even download a wallet, receive free Zeno and something called FUSD. But I will touch on some of the really unique properties and initiatives being launched on Zeno. One, there is a Zeno peer-to-peer exchange where you can trade assets without any third parties. In fact, you can have a wallet that has a token in it, and you can trade that token with somebody else directly through their wallet without any intermediary. And if you stop and think about, when you stop and think about the, you know, I had just had a eureka moment when that happened, and it was a friend of mine, Dan O'Neill. We traded a free Ross token for a free Julian Assange token, just to test it out. And it's like, this could be anything. We could be trading financial instruments, you know, NFTs, cars, you name it. There's Zeno Bay, which is a peer-to-peer marketplace. It's not a dark market, but it's a place for selling goods legally, but again, no third parties. It has PGP encryption, so buyer and seller can interact without being spied on or eavesdropped. And there's an interesting feature being integrated into Zeno, escrow contracts. So let's say you're going to buy something from somebody and you've never met them before. You both put a certain amount, you know, say $50 worth of escrow into an escrow account. Using a mutually assured destruction model, you now have an incentive, financial incentive, to work out the transaction amongst yourselves. And so this is really powerful technology that you can build an infinite number of applications on. This is my favorite project currently on Zeno because I think this is an answer to stablecoins, to Tether, to USDC, to the EU CBDC that's coming. It's called Freedom Dollar. The ticker symbol is FUSD. And this is an algorithmic stablecoin that is completely private, built on Zeno. So the transactions can't be frozen. You can't view the individual transactions. But, and this is really important, it's not backed by US Treasuries. It's not backed by US dollars. It's backed by over-collateralized Zeno. So Zeno is what's backing the stablecoin, but the stablecoin itself is pegged to $1. So when you're using this, you have the convenience which merchants need. People like the, you know, things are still priced in dollars. We may not like it, I don't like it, but that isn't going to change soon. People want that stability, although losing 99% of purchasing power in 80 years isn't all that great, but that's still stable. But you're not funding the war machine using this. So I encourage you to check that out. There's also something called confidential layer. So you're going to be able to tokenize Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Bitcoin Cash and make those transparent blockchains private and spendable with low transaction fees. So I know there are a lot of people that thought Bitcoin was anonymous, and there are still people that think, well, you know, I don't have that much, you know, in Bitcoin, so I'm probably safe, or I never used a centralized exchange, so I'm safe. I will tell you, I've had in the last 90 days, 3 different people come to me with either a contentious divorce situation or a situation where they have a dispute with a business partner. There are now private investigators that get certification in something called chainalysis, where they can just take your public key and track all of your transactions, because it's a public ledger, and all of this information, all of this transaction information is being put into a central database so that it can be queried by these private investigators. And so they're continuing to aggregate. They get the information from exchanges, and they're mapping the whole thing out. And so really, I would argue, no one is safe with Bitcoin. Even people that say, oh, I've never used a centralized exchange. If you did a peer-to-peer transaction with somebody that was leveraged by the government, and the government forced them to disclose their counterparties, all it takes is one of your transactions to be tracked, and they can see everything that you've done. So confidential layer is key. It's going to add privacy to these transparent blockchains and add 2 trillion plus potential buying power to the privacy ecosystem that can be used for day-to-day transactions. I'm going to be on the podcast with Sal in our tent tonight. It starts at 7:30 to 9:30, and one of the things that we're going to be talking about are the kinds of applications that you can build on Zeno and what you can privately tokenize. But I'll talk about a couple of quick examples. Imagine walking down the street in your town and you see a local restaurant or local shop and you want to buy $50 worth of equity in it. Well, I mean, right now, what the requirements to go through the SEC and raise money and document all of that are prohibitive. But imagine a situation where you can do all of that privately. Just buy $50 worth of it, have a token directly in your wallet that you can use, and you can trade without any third parties, without the SEC, without any of these over-regulated markets that are controlled by crooks. Or you can imagine an NFT, a privacy NFT, that gives you access to events. So now if you show your NFT, you can gain access to a concert or whatever type of a venue it happens to be without anybody sharing your individual identity or information. And this is one, because I'm kind of a nerd. I like to sit around and think about different applications of tokenization. Don't agree too fast. Yes. But imagine you could crowdfund a lawsuit against Big Pharma. I mean, this is an interesting situation that happens right now. There are organizations that will fund lawsuits, but they don't want to be targeted if it's disclosed that they were the ones funding a lawsuit against Pfizer. There's retribution for that. So imagine being able to tokenize a lawsuit. So it goes on and on and on, but it's really critical that we understand that tokenization is inevitable. It's going to happen. It is the evolution of the database. The battleground now is technocracy versus freedom. And I decided to co-sponsor this tent at this Pork Fest. Well, for one, I was hoping we'd be celebrating Ross and Roger and Ian. But, we got one, and hopefully by next Pork Fest, we'll have the other two. But the other thing that's going on here is this is a Moneratopia daylight tent, but you have a lot of Zeno projects in there as well. We have to learn from what happened with the hijacking of Bitcoin. We had a great panel discussion about that yesterday, but I'll tell you, it's really easy to divide and conquer the liberty movement and the crypto space. We took Bitcoin, which was once everybody's shining hope, and fractured and split it into 20,000 pieces. And even today, people start working on various projects, and they start becoming maximalists. We have to unite against, there's a common enemy, and that common enemy is technocracy. Maximalism will not work. We need a bunch of solutions. We need a market-based approach. So I'm grateful that we have multiple privacy projects here. The other tent along the way is also privacy project-oriented, and people in both tents know each other, like each other, work with and use each other's cryptocurrency. That's the spirit that we need to defeat technocracy. We also can't give up on our prisoners of war. So we need to continue to stand up for for Roger, for Ian, for Roman Storm, for all of the developers in the privacy space that are still facing lawfare from the federal government, despite the fact that Trump won and Trump declared that the war on crypto was over. That memo has not gotten to the DOJ. If you had a Hawk2a meme coin, or if you were pushing some meme token, you probably already had your case dismissed. But these criminal cases are still ongoing, and that we need to elevate our voices and make sure that we don't stop doing everything that we can until our prisoners of war are out. We also have to call out bad actors. I think sometimes the Liberty community doesn't do that very well. We often say, well, just let them do their own thing. Let's be clear. We are infiltrated constantly by the deep state and by people that come in to intentionally create disruption. So we need to call this out. We're already starting to see this in the privacy space. We're starting to see bad actors come in, try to create division around political lines, around social lines, and we can't allow what happened to Bitcoin to happen to the privacy space. So I just want to close by saying, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's a lot more going on. Right after this talk, in the Daylight Tent, there is a Zeno workshop. The second one, actually, I forgot to update, but at 7:30 to 9:30, I'll be on with Sal, and this is going to be going on live at our tent. And then tomorrow night at 8 p.m., we're going to have a free Roger, free Ian. I'll call it a party because we're not going to have talks or speeches or anything. It's just going to be a get-together to celebrate these guys and figure out how we can help get them out. So, thank you. Are there any questions? I guess we still have a little bit of time. Yep.
I'm a little slow and I don't understand a lot of this stuff, but my understanding that stablecoins basically were just backed by currencies, and as you said, they're treasuries. What is the mechanism by which they track you? When you do transactions, does your identity go along with the transaction, or does it all go to a central database? I don't understand how stablecoins in themselves are a privacy problem.
Well, right now, when the stablecoins are minted, at that point in time, know your customer and anti-money laundering laws are going to be applied at the point of minting. So that's when that's going to be a requirement upon the creation of the initial issuance. But that's only the that's the starting point. It's only going to get worse from there, because when you track the history of financial surveillance going back to the Bank Secrecy Act in 1970, it never goes reverse. It only goes towards more programmability. And soon it'll be captured by banks, and then they'll require the banks to issue certain contracts that allow more programmability and tracking.
So my current concern is that we're headed towards hyperinflation, and that Bitcoin is the trap that they're planning on having us all run into to save the bond and treasury market.
So your concern is that because of hyperinflation, people are going to move into Bitcoin, and that's a trap?
Yes.
I agree that that's a trap. In fact, if you look at when Bitcoin was hijacked, and it was hijacked many different times, but at some point, it's an open source project, and one of the groups that stepped in to fund the development of Bitcoin was MIT. So the same group that funded this switch from digital cash to digital gold, it should be slow and expensive and something that's only a store of value that you never use, funded all 3 US CBDC pilots. So I agree with you, and I think that Bitcoin is more confiscatable than physical gold because now it's all tracked. And I think that because of the hijacking, there are some things that have happened technically that have ruined the economic incentives of Bitcoin and are going to lead it to increasing the supply cap from 21 million.
Quick question with the FUSD. Obviously, we want to comply with all the tax rules, but it asks you every year, did you buy, sell, trade any digital currency? The answer would be yes on every transaction you do with that, whereas cash, at least, you don't. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, certainly consult your own tax attorney and accountant on issues regarding the IRS. Roger. But beyond that, physical cash. So first of all, if you're using physical cash, you're still supporting the war machine. So, but there are also serial numbers on cash, but I actually started investigating what's going on with physical cash, and they're working on nanotech and other tracking mechanisms for physical cash. So physical cash, don't think physical cash is going to remain something that's going to be not tracked, because it's heading in that direction if it isn't banned outright. Oh, and to that point, I think in this Genius Act, I don't know if this ended up passing in the final legislation or not, but there was something in there that says if your bank fails, people that were issued stable coins get paid out first. Thank you. Yep. Any other questions?
Regarding what you just said about cash serial numbers, even if they know that this dollar bill has serial number X, it can go through a million different people by the time they're interested in it again. So how was that tracking anybody?
Well, it's more of an issue when they start using RFID and nanotechnology. You know, imagine them being able to physically track where the bill went. And you know, I know a lot of people like cash, but we're 96% digital, and let's face it, if you're having, let's use Cash Friday, and you're using it to get your, you know, hair appointment done or to buy lunch, you're still getting direct deposit, your mortgage, all of your major transactions. You're really not, you're really just fighting at the periphery. You're not hitting at the root of the problem.
On the question about Bitcoin as a trap, you had mentioned briefly that there's a possibility they can go beyond that 21 million cap. And I always wondered, since Bitcoin's been captured by the banking establishment, can they start doing what, for example, hedge funds do and big brokerages, for example, naked shorting, which is rampant in the brokerage industry? If they want to drive the price of a stock down, they can sell it, shares that don't exist, basically.
Oh, sure.
Do you see any scenarios in Bitcoin where they can exceed that 21 million?
Yeah, I can see them doing that all the time. In fact, I think my guess is if everybody took all their crypto off of all of the centralized exchanges, you'll find that they don't have the actual coins backed one-to-one. I think this stuff is already going on to a certain degree, and you can look at FTX as an example of that. Any other questions? All right, great. So again, I encourage you to go to the Daylight Tent at 5 o'clock for the Zeno workshop. Thank you.